Hello, everybody. This is the first recording for project 4, task 1. Now, this is the Android code. I'll run the file to show how it works. Now, this is the interface for my application. So my application is essentially a cocktail recipe fetcher. What it essentially does is on inputting the name of a cocktail, it helps extract the recipe and other relevant information about a cocktail. For example, let's search for a mojito. On pressing fetch recipe, we can see that the name, the type of drink, and the recipe becomes available to us. How it works is the Android application hits the web application that is deployed on Heroku, which then sends a request to the third-party API for receiving cocktail recipes. And here we get the response for that. We can try it for one more input. We can try Long Island iced tea, and we're able to get the recipe for that as well. Now let's have a walkthrough to the code. Okay, now this is the code for the same. Now let's have a look at it. Now talking about the requirements for this code, let's start with requirement 1A, saying that there should be at least 3 different views. Now here we can see that the application has multiple views in front of us. We can see the text view that is here that shows get cocktails recipe. We can also see that there's an image view at the top right, this one, which is the image of a martini glass. And there are other views as well, including that of the edit search term, which is the edit view. And there are there are 2 buttons as well that we can see here. There is also a recipe display, again, view that helps. That's where the recipe gets added. This is the code for the same. And as you can see, the same views can be seen as part of the code here. Now, as part of 1B, which is the second requirement, we can see that the second requirement is it requires input from the user. We just saw that the code requires input in the text box, and on pressing fetch recipe, it is able to get us different results. We've already tried two different cocktails. We can try a third one as well, maybe sangria. That way we can see that based on the user input, it fetches the recipe. Now let's talk about the requirement 1C, which is that it should make an HTTP request using an appropriate HTTP method to your web service. Now let's have a look at the code to see that the HTTP request is actually taking place. Now here we can see that I have 2 methods in front of me, 2 classes in front of me. One is the cocktail recipe class that extends app compat activity. Now, when this class is used, the first method here is onCreate. Now, onCreate is the first method that is called as part of this class the moment the application starts. As you can see, there are 2 buttons here that I wrote functionality for. One is the submit button, which on clicking the button, what it essentially does is it extracts the search term, which is the name of the cocktail. And based on that, it calls the method search. Let's see what search does. Now, search is part of the get recipe class, and this is that method. It essentially helps get the recipe asynchronously. As you can see that it calls the execute method. I'm sorry, it calls the execute method as part of the async recipe search class. Now, the class for the same is this one. And as you can see, so this class is required essentially because we know that this class does not stall the UI, and instead of hanging the UI, it runs in the background as an external thread, as an extra thread. What happens is that it actually gets called as part of do in background method, which essentially calls research recipe, which does the actual calling of the third-party API, the web application API. Now here we can see the URL for our web application API, and which is called using the Android method, and which essentially helps us get the result for the same. Now it's the result that actually gets the JSON string, which is then converted into a JSON object here. And based on that JSON object, we print the relevant data into our UI for Android application. As we can see, it gives us the name, the type of drink, and the recipe, which is again here, the name, the type of drink, the recipe, where the name is sangria, the type of drink here is punch, and the recipe is also given here along with that. Now after that happens, and we actually get to print the same on the UI, the same is returned. This is actually the display recipe that helps display the recipe JSON file that was created before and prints it here. If the recipe JSON file is not null, then it is printed here as part of set text in the recipe view, which is the area that we see here. Now, the requirement 1D states that it should receive and parse an XML or JSON formatted reply from my web service, which does take place here. As we saw that we receive, as part of the result, we receive a JSON string that we convert to a JSON object, which then we display here. Now, requirement 1E is that it should display new information to the user, which again, it essentially does with every new cocktail drink that we add, that we want a value for. We get new information in terms of the name, the type of the drink, and recipe as well. For example, let's try one more cocktail, whiskey sour, and try to fetch the result for the same. And as we can see, we got the recipe for that as well. Now, the last one is 1F is that it should be repeatable, without the user having to restart the application. As we saw multiple times, this application is repeatable without having to restart it. We tried it for 4 different cocktails and we got the recipe for the same. Now, as part of the second requirement, let's check, which is implementation of the web service that is deployed on Heroku. Let's check that out as well. Requirement 2A states that it should implement a simple API, can be a single path. Now let's go from the Android application to the project 4 task 1 Java servlet code. Now, as you can see, this is the fetch recipe servlet code. This is the servlet that we were talking about. Fetch recipe is the API, the path that is required. It's a simple get path that helps get the information available that we need. This is the do get method for the same that hits the actual API, third-party API that we wanted to hit. This is the Cocktail DB API that gives us plenty of information. Based on that, based on the JSON structured information that we get on hitting this service, we try to create a JSON object out of it and get only the most relevant details from that. We get the name, the type of drink, and recipe which we send. As you can see that we are only sending the data that is most essential, that is required by the Android application itself. We're not sending any more data. Now that was part of 2A, a simple API called by a single path. Now let's see requirement 2B, which is receives an HTTP request from the native Android application. Now that's exactly what happened here. When we sent the HTTP request from the Android application from there, it essentially hit the fetch recipe uh, method API. We can again check that out. This is the Java servlet. And let's have a look at the Android application to see if fetch recipe was the one that was called in our deployed Heroku implementation. This is the deployed Heroku implementation, which is currently deployed. And as we can see, fetch recipe is the API that is being called with the parameter name and the cocktail name that we added as part of the text box. Again, going back to the code, let's check out the C part of second requirement, which is it should execute business logic appropriate to your application. This includes fetching the JSON information from some third-party API and processing the response. As we can see, this is the third-party API, and on doing a get there, we received a JSON object, we received a JSON string as part of result, which we created to a JSON object. As just to reiterate once, this Cocktail DB API is not a banned API, and I did not do any screen scraping to get this data. I just sent a request to the third-party API and got using get request method and received a JSON object as a reply as a response. Now checking requirement 2 part D. Let's see what it says. It says replies to the Android application with a JSON formatted response. The schema of the response can be of your own design. Now, I did the exact same thing here. I created a JSON response here, and I'm only returning the 3 important information that I'm displaying on my Android application, which is the name, the type of drink, and the recipe for the cocktail. And I am sending that out as well. So this is the response output that I have generated, and that's what I send back. Just to reiterate that I have not used a banned API, and also I'm not sending back more information to the Android application than is needed. This is it for project 4, task 1. Thank you so much.